A vast desert, dry and empty for decades, suddenly becomes the stage for a daring experiment that changes everything beneath the surface. Life begins to emerge in unexpected ways, transforming the land and the creatures that inhabit it. Over time, hidden forces alter the ecosystem, revealing patterns and surprises that defy belief. What is happening in this desert is unlike anything seen before. The audacious experiment begins. In the early 2000s, conservation groups and wildlife authorities in northern Mexico initiated a project that many experts considered extremely risky. They planned to release American bison into a dry desert region where rainfall was scarce, surface water rare, and vegetation limited. The land had been damaged for decades by overgrazing, fencing, and soil erosion. Large animals had long since disappeared, and much of the ground had been compacted, hindering plant growth. This area lies within the northern grasslands zone, connected to the Chihuahuan Desert. Although it appears arid today, historical and fossil records show that this region once had vast grasslands. Bison lived here naturally for thousands of years, but were driven out in the 19th century due to hunting, the expansion of cattle ranching, and habitat destruction. By the late 1800s, bison had completely disappeared from Mexico. The reintroduction effort focused on protected lands managed by conservation organizations in collaboration with the Mexican government. These areas were chosen because they were large, fenced, and legally protected from commercial grazing and development. The goal was not breeding for production or tourism, but ecological restoration through the return of a keystone species. The first group of bison was small. They were carefully selected from genetically healthy herds in North America. Veterinarians tested them to ensure they were disease-free. The animals were transported under strict protocols to reduce stress and injury. Once they arrived, they were placed in a controlled reserve without long-term artificial feeding programs. This decision was controversial. Critics argued that the environment couldn't support animals of that size. Bison can weigh hundreds of kilograms and require vast amounts of food. The land showed simple visible grass, droughts were common, and temperatures reached extremes. There were no permanent rivers in the reserve. Proponents of the project relied on ecological history rather than modern appearances. They pointed to research showing that desert grasslands can recover when natural grazing patterns return. Bison graze differently than cattle. They move constantly and don't stay in one place long enough to damage plants. Their movement spreads the impact over large areas rather than concentrating it. The first few months after the release were carefully monitored. Researchers tracked the animals using visual observation and later GPS collars. The bison didn't try to escape the reserve. They formed natural social groups, traveled long distances each day in search of food, and used shade and terrain to manage the heat. They showed no signs of immediate malnutrition. Water was the biggest concern. The reserve had only a few natural sources dependent on seasonal rainfall. During dry periods, the bison relied on their ability to travel long distances to find remaining water. Their physiology allowed them to tolerate dehydration better than many domesticated animals, a trait that helped them survive in harsh environments for thousands of years. The land itself showed no immediate changes. From a distance, the desert still appeared empty. Many observers believed the project would quietly fail over time. They expected the animals to weaken or die during prolonged droughts. Some predicted the experiment would end with the bison being removed to prevent suffering. What made this project different was patience. The scientists involved didn't expect quick results. They understood that ecological processes operate slowly. Soil recovery, plant regrowth, and the return of wildlife can take years or decades. The absence of visible changes didn't mean nothing was happening. The bison continued to survive the seasonal extremes. Offspring were born, demonstrating that the animals were reproducing successfully, a critical indicator that basic needs were being met. Reproduction does not occur in populations under chronic stress. By the end of the first few years, researchers confirmed that mortality rates were low and body condition remained stable. The bison had adapted to the landscape, defying the notion that the land was beyond recovery. The desert had passed the bison's first test of adaptation, but what began beneath their hooves would soon become visible, revealing a transformation far greater than the animals themselves. Bison, the key survivors. By the late 1800s, bison populations in Mexico had been wiped out. Hunting, commercial cattle ranching, and habitat conversion had completely eliminated these animals, contributing to soil degradation, reduced plant diversity, and decreased habitat quality for other species. Ecosystems became simpler and less resilient, and the once dynamic and productive grasslands were transformed into areas dominated by desert-adapted plants and sparse vegetation. When conservationists began the reintroduction project, they chose bison because of their role as ecosystem engineers. Unlike cattle or sheep, bison constantly move across large areas. Their grazing patterns prevent the overuse of any single patch of land. They eat a variety of grasses and herbaceous plants, but their selective feeding allows some plants to grow stronger. Their wallowing behavior, where they roll on the ground to scratch and clean themselves, creates depressions in the soil that can retain rainwater and help seeds germinate. Their dung enriches the soil and carries seeds from other areas, aiding the natural spread of vegetation. The bison used were carefully selected from healthy herds in the United States. Each animal was tested to ensure it was disease-free, and genetic diversity was prioritized to prevent inbreeding and maintain a sustainable population. They were transported under strict conditions to minimize stress and injury. Once introduced to the Mexican Desert Reserve, the bison received no supplemental food or water, relying solely on natural resources. Despite the harsh conditions, the bison adapted well. The reserve's climate features high summer temperatures, occasional nighttime frosts in winter, and low, unpredictable rainfall. The animals demonstrated their ability to survive these extremes. They traveled long distances daily in search of water and food. Their thick coats protected them from both heat and cold. The herd remained cohesive, with females leading social groups and dominant males maintaining order. Reproduction was a key indicator of adaptation. In the early years, calves were born successfully, demonstrating that their nutritional and water needs were being met despite the challenging environment. Researchers monitored calf survival rates, which remained high. This suggested that the bison were not only surviving, but thriving. Healthy reproduction also indicated that the herd could expand and exert a greater influence on the ecosystem, a crucial step for the restoration of desert grasslands. The bison's impact on the land began almost immediately. Their hooves broke up the compacted soil, creating microdepressions that could retain rainwater. Their wallows became small habitats for seeds, and their dung added nutrients to the soil. Although these changes were subtle at first, they marked the beginning of an ecological transformation. Soil samples taken from areas frequented by bison showed a gradual increase in organic matter. Small plants began to appear where nothing had grown before. The presence of bison also created opportunities for other wildlife. Small mammals, insects, and birds began to reappear in areas affected by the herd's movement. These animals found new refuges in plants and wallows created by the bison. Predators were almost absent in the reserve, so the bison could expand without pressure, allowing researchers to study the herd's natural behavior and ecological impact without interference. The community's response was cautious, but gradually improved. Locals were skeptical at first. Ranchers feared the bison would compete with cattle for food or damage fences. Conservationists worked to educate the communities, explaining the herd's ecological purpose and the long-term benefits of the bison's presence to restore the grasslands. Activities included guided tours, educational programs, and updates on bison health and reproduction. The bison's early success in this environment demonstrated a critical point. Deserts that appear barren can support large herbivores if the species is historically adapted to the landscape. Their grazing, movement, and rolling began to create the conditions necessary for plants to return. Even in an area with low rainfall, high temperatures, and sparse vegetation, the bison demonstrated that keystone species play a vital role in ecosystem recovery. As the bison continued to establish themselves, their influence extended beyond mere survival, quietly reshaping the land and paving the way for a broader ecological revitalization unseen for decades. The silent transformation. Once bison settled in the northern Mexican desert, the effects on the ecosystem began in ways easily overlooked but crucial for long-term recovery. One of the first noticeable changes was in soil structure. The bison's movement across the terrain disturbed compacted layers of earth, allowing air and water to penetrate deeper. This process increased soil porosity and improved water retention, even in areas that had remained dry for years. Researchers observed that areas frequently traversed by the herd showed higher moisture levels compared to undisturbed areas. The bison wallows became small, functional ecosystems. These depressions collected water during seasonal rains, providing moisture for seeds and seedlings. Over time, native grasses began to sprout in these microhabitats. These grasses were primarily perennial species that had historically existed in the desert but had disappeared due to overgrazing and habitat degradation. The presence of the bison essentially recreated the natural conditions that had allowed these plants to survive for centuries. Another important development was the nutrient cycle. Bison dung contained a mixture of nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic matter that enriched the desert's poor soils. This natural fertilizer allowed young plants to establish themselves where growth had previously been limited. Scientists noted that vegetation cover began to increase in the patches most frequented by bison, indicating that nutrient deposition played a significant role in initiating vegetation recovery. In addition to the changes in the soil and plants, insect populations began to recover. Areas with new vegetation attracted grasshoppers, beetles, and pollinating insects. These insects contributed to the plant's well-being by pollinating flowers and aiding in seed dispersal. In turn, birds returned to feed on insects and use the newly grown vegetation for shelter. Even small mammals, such as rodents and rabbits, began to appear in the patches of vegetation created by bison activity. These species were key to maintaining seed dispersal and enriching the soil through their digging. Water management in the reserve also benefited from the bison's presence. Previously, rainwater ran off quickly across the hard desert surface, but the depressions created by rolling and hooves slowed the water's movement, allowing it to infiltrate the soil. This gradual infiltration favored plant growth and stabilized areas prone to erosion. Over the years, these small water retention features expanded the habitable range for plants and other animals. The interaction between bison and plants was particularly significant. Grazing stimulated plant growth in ways reminiscent of the natural disturbance regimes seen in historical grasslands. As bison grazed on old grass, new shoots emerged, creating a cycle of renewal. Some native grasses, which had become scarce, began to expand again, forming a more diverse plant community. The renewed plant diversity created suitable microhabitats for additional species, gradually increasing the complexity of the ecosystem. Even the fungi and microbial communities in the soil showed signs of recovery. Scientists collected samples from areas affected by bison and found greater microbial activity compared to control plots where bison did not graze. Microbes play a key role in nutrient cycling, helping plants absorb essential elements such as nitrogen and phosphorus. The combined effect of soil aeration, nutrient input, and microbial activity created favorable conditions for sustained plant growth over time. The research teams also monitored how the vegetation recovery affected temperature regulation. Areas with greater vegetation cover showed slightly lower surface temperatures compared to bare regions. This cooling effect helped conserve soil moisture and created a microclimate more suitable for both plants and small animals. Gradually, the desert began to develop patches reminiscent of the mosaic of historical grasslands, even though the surrounding landscape remained arid. Over time, small ecological networks began to form around the bison's activity zones. Plants, insects, birds, and mammals interacted in ways unseen in the desert for decades. These networks were initially fragile, but they demonstrated the potential for larger-scale ecosystem stability. Each new species that returned contributed to the overall resilience of the area, reinforcing the recovery process. The changes that occurred in this phase were subtle but essential. Unlike the visible growth of the bison herd, the silent transformation of the soil, water, and plant communities laid the groundwork for a more dramatic ecological recovery in the following years. What began as almost invisible improvements under the bison's hooves would soon become a widespread rebirth, transforming lifeless areas into thriving habitats capable of supporting diverse life forms. The desert comes alive. After several years of silent transformation, the desert of northern Mexico began to show visible signs of ecological revitalization. Vegetation, almost absent for decades, began to form continuous patches. Grass species that had historically existed in the Chihuahuan Desert expanded into open areas. The plants grew taller and denser, creating shade and shelter for small animals. These changes altered the physical character of the landscape, making it greener and more varied than in recent memory. The return of the plants attracted large populations of insects. Pollinators such as bees, butterflies, and beetles became more abundant, feeding on flowers and dispersing seeds throughout the recovering grasslands. This increase in insects provided food for birds, which began to nest in previously barren areas. The presence of birds added another layer of ecological interaction, helping to control the insect population and contributing to seed dispersal. Small mammals also returned to areas with more vegetation. Rodents, rabbits, and ground squirrels found refuge among the growing grasses. Their digging activity further improved soil aeration, increasing water retention and nutrient availability. These mammals became an important part of the desert food web, supporting predators and promoting ecological balance. The vegetation reduced surface runoff, slowing the movement of water across the soil. This allowed rainwater to infiltrate deeper, replenishing underground moisture reserves. The natural water retention created by plant growth and bison wallowing supported the germination of additional species, reinforcing the recovery cycle. The bison herd continued to influence the vegetation through grazing and movement. By feeding on mature plants, they stimulated regrowth, promoting a diverse age structure in grasses and herbaceous plants. Their movements created trails that reclaimed vegetation. The return of vegetation also affected carbon storage in the soil. Roots stabilized the soil, preventing erosion, while organic matter from decaying plants and bison dung enriched the desert's poor soils. Researchers measured gradual increases in soil carbon content, indicating that the desert was beginning to function more like a healthy grassland ecosystem. As vegetation cover increased, microclimates developed within the desert. Shaded areas under taller grasses and near wallows maintained cooler temperatures and higher humidity than the exposed sand, providing refuge for animals during the extreme heat. These microclimates supported life that could not survive in fully exposed conditions, encouraging the return of small mammals, reptiles, and birds. Predators, though limited in the reserve, began to appear occasionally. Coyotes and raptors took advantage of the growing populations of rodents and insects. Their presence added another dimension to the emerging food web, demonstrating that the ecosystem was becoming more complex and self-sustaining. Scientists noted that the desert was no longer a uniform, arid landscape. Instead, it had become a mosaic of grasslands, shrublands, water-retaining depressions, and microhabitats. Each patch supported distinct species and ecological interactions, creating a dynamic and resilient environment. Observers recorded that the desert's appearance had changed. The area was transformed, going from dry, dusty plains to areas with clear signs of life and ecological function. Community involvement also increased as the landscape visibly changed. Local residents, ranchers, and conservation volunteers began to recognize the ecological value of the recovering desert. Educational programs and guided tours helped people understand the role of bison and the importance of native plant growth in supporting wildlife. Public interest grew, and the project gained recognition as a successful example of ecological restoration in a desert environment. The desert revitalization also attracted scientific attention beyond Mexico. Researchers from other countries visited to study how the bison and restored vegetation influence the soil, water, and biodiversity. The area became a case study on species reintroduction in deserts, demonstrating that even arid landscapes can recover if keystone species are reintroduced and allowed to interact naturally with the environment. The desert had overcome the subtle change, developing into a functional ecosystem. but the true extent of the recovery and the effects on surrounding areas were only just beginning to unfold. Rewilding beyond expectations. Following the visible revitalization of vegetation and the return of wildlife, conservationists expanded the bison reintroduction program to cover more areas of northern Mexico. New herds were released in other reserves and protected areas, including parts of Coahuila and Chihuahua, to broaden the ecological impact. These expansions aimed to strengthen population connectivity, allowing bison to interact across wider landscapes and encouraging natural behaviors that improve ecosystem functioning. The expansion also focused on lands previously degraded by agriculture or overgrazing. These areas had poor soils, minimal vegetation, and little wildlife. The movement of bison in these areas began to alter soil compaction, promoting seed dispersal and improving nutrient cycling. Over time, patches of grasses and small shrubs began to appear, creating recovery corridors that connected with areas previously restored by the first herd. This gradual expansion increased the availability of habitat for small mammals, birds, and insects. Ecological monitoring during this phase showed that multiple processes reinforced each other. Bison grazing stimulated plant regrowth while preventing one species from dominating the others. Rubbing created microhabitats that collected water and supported seed germination. Soil improvements allowed for deeper root growth, stabilizing the soil and retaining moisture. Together, these processes created self-sustaining feedback loops, accelerating ecosystem recovery. Expanding herds also increased the genetic diversity and resilience of the bison population. As herds interacted, gene flow occurred naturally, reducing the risk of inbreeding and maintaining healthy reproduction. This was especially important for long-term survival in challenging desert conditions, where natural population pressure could limit genetic variation. As the desert ecosystem recovered, researchers documented significant increases in biodiversity. Pollinating insects became abundant in the restored grassland patches, supporting flowering plants and accelerating their reproduction. Birds returned not only for food, but also to nest in areas where vegetation grew taller and denser. Small mammals used the shelter provided by the plants to evade predators and reproduce. Even occasional coyote sightings indicated that predator-prey relationships were being reestablished, fulfilling key ecological functions. The restoration also had measurable effects on the soil and climate. Soil tests showed increased levels of organic matter and improved carbon storage, contributing to the long-term health of the ecosystem. The vegetation cover helped reduce surface temperatures and stabilized wind-eroded areas. Water retention increased in the restored patches, providing essential resources during periods of low rainfall. These changes demonstrated that rewilding could restore ecological processes, even in a desert environment. The project began to gain national and international attention. Researchers and environmental organizations highlighted it as one of the world's most successful examples of desert rewilding. Case studies emphasize the importance of keystone species in ecosystem restoration, showing that a single species can trigger cascading benefits for the soil, vegetation, and wildlife. The Mexican government and local conservation agencies used the program as a model for similar efforts in other degraded areas. Community participation grew alongside scientific interest. Local residents began to notice benefits from land improvement, including more stable soils for grazing and the return of native plants useful for forage and traditional practices. Educational programs taught about the role of bison and the ecological importance of the restored habitats. Over time, the project became a symbol of successful collaboration between scientists, government agencies, and local communities. The expansion also revealed new challenges. As bison populations grew, occasional conflicts arose with human land use. Some areas required additional fencing or corridors to prevent peasels that the herds were entering agricultural lands. Balancing ecological restoration with human activity became a critical part of long-term management planning. These challenges emphasized that successful rewilding required not only wildlife management, but also coordination with local stakeholders and careful land use policies. Despite these challenges, the results were remarkable. What began as a single herd in a reserve had now influenced multiple areas, creating interconnected habitats with greater biodiversity, healthier soils, and functioning ecological processes. The desert was no longer a static landscape, but a dynamic system capable of supporting a wide variety of species. The success of the restoration extended beyond the immediate reserves, influencing the surrounding landscapes. But as the bison continued to expand, new interactions and pressures emerged that would test the limits of this desert rebirth. The unexpected test. Experts closely monitoring the bison reintroduction and desert recovery emphasized the project's unprecedented success, while also cautioning that the ecosystem remained fragile. Ecologists noted the desert had undergone a remarkable transformation, with expanding grasslands, improved soil, and the return of wildlife, but stressed that ongoing monitoring and management were essential. The restoration of key species like bison had triggered cascading ecological benefits, but experts highlighted that climate variability, human activity, and potential disease outbreaks could still challenge long-term stability. Researchers from Mexican universities and international conservation organizations analyzed data from the past decade. Soil measurements showed consistent increases in organic matter and water retention in areas impacted by bison. Vegetation studies indicated the return of native grasses, perennials, and small shrubs in previously arid patches. Experts emphasized that these changes were not temporary. The bison had initiated processes that could be sustained if the ecosystem remained protected. Water availability was a major focus of the expert recommendations. Although the desert showed improvement in soil moisture and microhabitats, seasonal droughts remained a serious threat. Experts suggested that ongoing management should prioritize protecting water sources in key areas where bison congregate. They noted that artificial water points should be used only sparingly, as the goal was to allow natural behaviors and adaptations to continue supporting ecosystem resilience. Human interaction with the landscape was another area of concern. Conservationists and wildlife managers worked with local communities to establish corridors, buffer zones, and agreements to prevent conflicts between bison and livestock. Experts emphasized that the project's success depended on collaboration among government agencies, local ranchers, and environmental organizations. Public education programs were recommended to ensure that communities understood the ecological importance of bison and the restored desert habitat. Looking ahead, experts outlined strategies for expanding and protecting the restored ecosystem. They advocated for reintroducing additional bison herds into connected reserves to promote genetic diversity and natural dispersal. Long-term monitoring of vegetation, soil, and wildlife populations would allow managers to quickly identify and respond to environmental stressors. Scientists emphasized that maintaining biodiversity was critical, including monitoring small mammals, insects, birds, and occasional predators that had returned to the area. Experts also highlighted the potential for this project to serve as a model for other arid regions. They noted that restoring key species can catalyze ecosystem recovery, even in environments previously considered too harsh or degraded. By observing the interactions among bison, plants, soil, and wildlife, conservationists gained valuable insights into how deserts and semi-arid grasslands could be effectively rewilded. Policy recommendations were a core component of the expert guidance. Protected reserves needed legal enforcement to prevent encroachment and overgrazing. Adaptive management plans were needed to address unexpected challenges, such as extreme weather events or diseases. Experts emphasized the long-term success of the project would require sustained funding, research, and community engagement to ensure the desert did not revert to its degraded state. The broader ecological impact of the project was also highlighted. As the restored vegetation stabilized the soil and sequestered carbon, it enhanced the desert's ability to adapt to climate change. Experts suggested that similar approaches could contribute to carbon sequestration, biodiversity conservation, and water management in other arid lands globally. The lessons learned in northern Mexico offered guidance for rewilding projects in deserts around the world. The desert had been transformed under the guidance of experts and the influence of bison, but its future depended on continued vigilance, careful policy decisions, and the ability of both humans and nature to respond to new challenges on the horizon. This brings us to the incredible story of how bison transformed a once barren desert into a thriving ecosystem. The project demonstrates the power of keystone species and careful conservation, but the desert's future still depends on ongoing efforts and expert management. What do you think about this desert revival? It still depends on continued efforts and expert management. Could similar projects work in other extreme environments? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us your perspective on the bison's remarkable journey.